When billionaire David Sterling proposed to his influencer girlfriend on Michigan Avenue, he thought he was living his perfect moment. But then he saw her, his pregnant ex-wife, collapsing on the sidewalk just yards away. What happened next shocked millions of viewers and exposed one of the most twisted schemes in social media history. This isn't just another rich man's drama. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman systematically destroyed by lies, who discovered that sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Her collapse wasn't just from exhaustion, it was the beginning of a viral reckoning that would bring down an empire built on deception. Brace yourself for a tale of manipulation, hidden recordings, and justice served in the most unexpected way. This 60-minute journey will leave you questioning everything you think you know about social media, truth, and the price of revenge. The late afternoon sun blazed down on Michigan Avenue as Sarah Mitchell clutched her worn canvas bag, fighting another wave of nausea. 7 months pregnant and running on 3 hours of sleep. She forced herself to keep walking toward the bus stop. Her feet ached in the cheap flats she'd bought at a thrift store, but she couldn't afford to miss her second job at the downtown bookstore. 2 blocks ahead, a crowd had gathered around what looked like a street performance. Sarah squinted through her fatigue, then froze. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the familiar silhouette of David Sterling, her ex-husband, kneeling on one knee in the middle of the sidewalk. Victoria Kane stood before him, her perfectly manicured hands covering her mouth in mock surprise. Her long blonde hair caught the sunlight like spun gold, and her designer dress probably cost more than Sarah's rent for 6 months. The 26-year-old influencer had 2 million followers who hung on her every perfectly curated word. "Will you marry me, Victoria?" David's voice carried across the street, amplified by the phones recording every moment. The crowd erupted in cheers as Victoria nodded dramatically, throwing her arms around the billionaire tech mogul who had once promised Sarah forever. Sarah's vision blurred as the memories crashed over her. 3 years ago, she had been the one in designer clothes, standing beside David at charity galas and corporate events. She had been his marketing executive, his partner, his wife. Now she was invisible, forgotten, erased from the narrative of his success. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was witnessing this moment while carrying his child, a secret she had guarded fiercely for 7 months. When she discovered her pregnancy 2 months after their devastating divorce, she had made the painful decision to keep it to herself. David had made his feelings clear during the divorce proceedings when he accused her of corporate espionage and painted her as a gold digger who had married him for his money. Victoria's laugh tinkled across the street like broken glass. Sarah remembered that laugh from the depositions, when Victoria had testified about Sarah's alleged misconduct with such convincing tears that even Sarah's own lawyer had looked doubtful. The influencer had played her part perfectly. The innocent third party who had simply fallen in love with a man whose wife had betrayed him. But Sarah knew the truth. Victoria had orchestrated the entire downfall, planting evidence and manipulating situations to frame her for stealing company secrets. The younger woman had seen David's success as the ultimate prize, and Sarah as an obstacle to be eliminated. And she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. Sarah's phone buzzed with a social media notification. Against her better judgment, she glanced at the screen. The proposal was already trending. #DavidSterlingProposal had thousands of posts, with comments pouring in about the romantic billionaire and his stunning fiancée. #PerfectCouple was gaining momentum, accompanied by photos of David and Victoria looking like they had stepped out of a magazine. A sharp pain shot through Sarah's lower back, and she stumbled slightly. The stress of the past year had taken its toll on her body. Working 2 jobs while pregnant, living in a cramped studio apartment with neighbors who partied until 3 in the morning, and fighting constant anxiety about money had pushed her to her breaking point. She needed to get home and rest, but the crowd was growing larger, blocking her path to the bus stop. People were streaming out of nearby buildings, drawn by the commotion and the promise of witnessing a moment that would surely go viral. Sarah found herself trapped in the chaos, pushed closer to the scene she desperately wanted to escape. Through the maze of smartphones and excited faces, David's eyes suddenly found hers across the street. For a moment that felt like eternity, they stared at each other. Sarah saw a flicker of something in his expression: surprise, guilt, maybe even shame. But then Victoria was pulling him to his feet, kissing him for the cameras, and the moment shattered like everything else between them. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned away, desperate to disappear before anyone else noticed her. But the crowd had thickened around her, and escape seemed impossible. The weight of her pregnancy, the heat of the sun, and the crushing reality of her situation crashed down on her like a tidal wave. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of falling, the gasps from the crowd, and the darkness that mercifully swallowed her whole. Sarah's collapse sent shockwaves through the crowd faster than any social media algorithm could have managed. The romantic proposal that had been trending moments before was instantly overshadowed by the dramatic sight of a pregnant woman crumpling to the pavement just yards away from the billionaire and his new fiancée. David Sterling stood frozen, his arms still around Victoria, as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The woman on the ground was unmistakably Sarah, though she looked nothing like the confident executive he had divorced 18 months ago. Her face was gaunt, her clothes worn, and her visibly pregnant form told a story that hit him like a physical blow. Victoria's grip tightened on his arm as she whispered urgently in his ear, "David, the cameras are still rolling. We need to handle this carefully." Her influencer instincts kicked in immediately, calculating the potential damage to their perfect moment. This wasn't part of the script she had so carefully orchestrated. The crowd around Sarah grew thicker as people pulled out their phones, no longer filming a romantic proposal, but a real-life drama unfolding on the streets of Chicago. Someone shouted for an ambulance while others live-streamed the scene to their followers. Within minutes, Hashtag Michigan Avenue Collapse was competing with hashtag David Sterling Proposal for trending status. "Is that his ex-wife?" someone in the crowd whispered loudly enough for the cameras to pick up. "Oh my God, she's pregnant." David felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him as he stood paralyzed between his past and his future. Every instinct told him to go to Sarah to check if she was okay, to find out if the child she was carrying could possibly be his. But Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into his arm like talons, anchoring him to his spot. "Think about the optics," Victoria hissed, her smile never wavering for the cameras. "If you go to her now, it'll ruin everything. People will think you still care about her. Is that the message you want to send on our engagement day?" The sound of sirens grew closer as paramedics pushed through the crowd. David watched helplessly as they knelt beside Sarah's unconscious form, checking her pulse and asking questions no one could answer. A police officer was already trying to disperse the crowd, but the phones kept recording, capturing every moment of what would surely become the most talked-about celebrity drama of the year. Marcus Thompson, David's head of security, appeared at his side with the smooth efficiency that had made him invaluable over the past 5 years. The former military man had been watching from the periphery, as he always did during public appearances, but the unfolding situation had clearly caught him off guard too. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "the ambulance is here. They're taking her to Northwestern Memorial. The media is going to want a statement." David nodded numbly, his eyes never leaving the paramedics as they carefully loaded Sarah onto a stretcher. She looked so small and fragile, Nothing like the fierce woman who had once challenged him in boardroom meetings and made him laugh until his sides hurt. The transformation was so complete, it made his chest ache with a guilt he thought he had buried. Victoria stepped closer to the nearest camera, her expression perfectly crafted to show concern without revealing too much. "This is such a tragic situation," she said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. "David and I are praying for this woman and her baby. We hope she gets the help she needs." The reporter, eating up every word, pressed closer. "Miss Kane, do you know who this woman is? There are rumors she's David Sterling's ex-wife." Victoria's pause was calculated to perfection, just long enough to suggest reluctance before she answered. "I don't think it's appropriate for us to speculate about someone's personal life during a medical emergency. Our thoughts are with her family right now." But David had stopped listening to Victoria's performance. He was watching the ambulance pull away, its lights flashing as it disappeared into traffic, carrying Sarah and whatever secrets she had been keeping. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but the phones were still recording, still broadcasting his frozen expression to millions of viewers who were already forming their own conclusions about what they had witnessed. His phone buzzed with notifications as his publicist, his assistant, and half his board of directors tried to reach him. The story was spreading like wildfire across every platform, with theories ranging from romantic drama to family secrets to corporate conspiracy. David Sterling's name was trending for all the wrong reasons, and the woman he thought he had successfully erased from his life was suddenly at the center of his biggest public relations nightmare. Marcus leaned in close, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "Sir, we need to decide how to handle this. The speculation is already getting out of control." David looked at Victoria, who was still performing for the cameras with practiced grace, then at the street where Sarah had fallen, then at his phone, which showed a flood of notifications that threatened to crash his entire digital existence. In the span of 10 minutes, his perfect proposal had become a viral catastrophe that would define his public image for years to come. But somewhere beneath the panic and the calculation, a deeper question was forming in his mind. If Sarah was 7 months pregnant, and they had been divorced for 18 months, there was only one brief window when the timing would work. One night of weakness and regret that had left them both with more regrets than they could carry. The night their child was conceived, and neither of them had been brave enough to talk about it since. Northwestern Memorial Hospital's emergency department buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, but the arrival of Sarah Mitchell had added an extra layer of tension. News vans were already gathering in the parking lot, having followed the ambulance from Michigan Avenue, and hospital security was working overtime to keep reporters from sneaking into the building. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been treating pregnancy complications for 15 years, but she had never had a patient whose medical emergency was being live-streamed to millions of viewers. As she reviewed Sarah's initial test results, her expression grew increasingly grim. Severe dehydration, dangerously low blood pressure, and signs of chronic malnutrition painted a picture of a woman who had been pushed far beyond her limits. Sarah stirred on the hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open to the harsh fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitoring equipment. For a moment, she felt disoriented, unsure where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the memories crashed back, the proposal, the crowd, the feeling of the world spinning away from her. "Try not to move too quickly, Doctor," Walsh said gently, checking the IV line that was slowly rehydrating Sarah's exhausted body. "You gave everyone quite a scare out there. I'm Dr. Walsh, and I need to ask you some questions about your pregnancy." Sarah's hands instinctively moved to her belly, relief flooding through her as she felt the familiar movement of her baby. "Is the baby okay? Please tell me the baby is okay." The baby's heartbeat is strong, Dr. Walsh assured her. But I'm concerned about you. When was the last time you had a full meal? Your blood sugar levels suggest you haven't been eating regularly, and your iron levels are critically low. The questions that followed painted a picture Sarah was ashamed to share. Working 60 hours a week between 2 jobs to afford her studio apartment, skipping meals to save money for prenatal vitamins, sleeping 4 hours a night because her neighbors' parties made rest impossible, living on stress and determination because she refused to ask for help from anyone, especially the man who had already made it clear she was unwelcome in his new life. Dr. Walsh's expression softened as she listened to Sarah's story. She had seen plenty of women struggling to make ends meet during pregnancy, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about this case. The contrast between Sarah's obvious education and refinement and her current circumstances suggested a dramatic fall from a very different life. Sarah, I need to be direct with you, Dr. Walsh said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Your body is showing signs of chronic stress that could seriously impact your pregnancy. You're at risk for preterm labor, and your baby isn't getting the nutrition needed for proper development. We need to keep you here for observation and get some fluids and nutrients into both of you. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Voices were raised, and someone was clearly arguing with the security staff. Dr. Walsh frowned and stepped toward the door, but it opened before she could reach it. David Sterling stood in the doorway, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from pushing through crowds and arguing with hospital staff. Marcus flanked him, looking uncomfortable, but determined to protect his employer from the media circus that had followed them from Michigan Avenue. Behind them, Victoria's voice could be heard demanding to be let through, though security was clearly holding her back. I need to see her, David said, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. I need to know if she's okay. Dr. Walsh stepped between David and Sarah's bed, her professional instincts overriding any recognition of his celebrity status. Sir, I don't know who you are, but this patient needs rest and privacy. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. He's my ex-husband, Sarah said quietly from the bed, her voice barely above a whisper. It's okay, doctor. He can stay. David approached the bed cautiously, as if Sarah might disappear if he moved too quickly. Up close, the changes in her appearance were even more shocking. The confident woman who had once managed million-dollar marketing campaigns looked fragile and exhausted, her cheekbones sharp from weight loss despite her pregnancy. Sarah, David started, then stopped, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. When I saw you fall, I thought, are you okay? Is the baby? The baby is fine, Sarah said, meeting his eyes for the first time since he had entered the room. Or will be, if I can manage to take better care of myself. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. David's eyes dropped to Sarah's pregnant belly, and she saw him doing the math, calculating dates and possibilities. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had hoped to have more time to prepare for it. Dr. Walsh cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps this conversation would be better held in private. I'll give you a few minutes, but then my patient needs rest. As the doctor left the room, David and Sarah faced each other across a gulf of hurt and misunderstanding that seemed impossible to bridge. The machines monitoring Sarah's vital signs beeped steadily, providing a rhythm to the silence that stretched between them. Is it mine? David asked finally, his voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the ambient noise of the hospital. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the night 18 months ago when they had both reached for each other in their shared grief over their failing marriage. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had left them both with more regrets than either could bear, but it had also given her the greatest gift of her life. "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his shocked gaze. "The baby is yours." The words hit David like a physical blow, confirming what he had suspected but hadn't dared to believe. He had a child on the way, a son or daughter he knew nothing about, carried by a woman he had hurt so deeply that she had chosen to face pregnancy alone rather than tell him the truth. Outside the room, Victoria's voice grew louder as she argued with security, demanding to be let in to support her fiancé during this difficult time. But inside the small hospital room, David and Sarah faced the reality that would reshape both their lives forever, whether they were ready for it or not. Within 2 hours of Sarah's collapse, the internet had exploded into a frenzy of speculation, memes, and conspiracy theories that would have impressed even Victoria's most ambitious viral campaigns. The hashtag Pregnant Ex-Wife Collapse was trending #1 worldwide, with over 2 million posts and counting. Amateur detectives were already digging through old photos, analyzing timelines, and building elaborate theories about David Sterling's secret family drama. Victoria Kane sat in the back of David's Bentley, her perfectly manicured fingers flying across her phone screen as she monitored the digital wildfire consuming her carefully crafted image. Her Instagram notifications had crashed the app twice, and her team of social media managers was working overtime to control the narrative that was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's control. "This is a disaster," she hissed into her phone, speaking to her publicist while Marcus drove them away from the hospital. "We had the perfect proposal moment, and now everyone's talking about his pregnant ex-wife instead of our engagement. Fix this. Rebecca, I don't care what it costs." Through the partition, Victoria could see David's reflection in the window. He had been silent since leaving the hospital, staring out at the Chicago skyline with an expression she had never seen before. The calculating businessman who had always put his image first seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone she didn't recognize and couldn't manipulate. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca Chen, her crisis management specialist. "Emergency meeting in 1 hour. We need to get ahead of this story before it destroys your brand. Some of the theories online are getting very close to the truth." Victoria's blood ran cold as she scrolled through the latest posts. Social media users had started connecting dots with frightening accuracy. Someone had found photos from David and Sarah's divorce proceedings, comparing them to current pictures and noting the timing. Another user had created a detailed timeline suggesting the pregnancy could only have resulted from a reconciliation attempt after the divorce was filed. The most damaging post came from an anonymous account that claimed to have inside information about the Sterling divorce. Sarah Mitchell didn't steal corporate secrets. The post read, "She was framed by someone who wanted her out of the picture. The real question is who had the most to gain from destroying her reputation and her marriage." Victoria's hands shook as she read the comments beneath the post. Users were sharing their own stories of workplace manipulation, of women being forced out of their jobs and relationships by younger rivals. The narrative was shifting from romantic drama to something much more sinister, and Victoria could feel her carefully constructed empire beginning to crumble. Her phone rang, displaying Rebecca's name. Victoria answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with panic. "How bad is it?" "Bad," Rebecca said without preamble. "Your follower count has dropped by 300,000 in the past 2 hours. Major brands are already pulling their partnership deals until this blows over. We need to go on the offensive immediately." "What do you mean?" "Offensive." "We need to control the narrative. Position you as the victim here, caught in the middle of David's messy past. Play up the angle that you had no idea about the pregnancy, that you're as shocked as everyone else. Generate sympathy, not suspicion." Victoria glanced toward the front of the car, where David was still lost in thought. She had worked too hard to get to this position to let his guilt destroy everything she had built. If controlling the narrative meant throwing him under the bus, so be it. "What about the other rumors?" Victoria asked quietly. "The ones about the divorce being a setup." Rebecca's pause was telling. "We stick to the official story. Sarah Mitchell was caught selling corporate secrets. End of discussion. If anyone tries to dig deeper, we shut it down with legal threats. David's lawyers are very good at making problems disappear." But even as Victoria agreed to the strategy, she knew the internet had a way of finding truth that legal teams couldn't suppress. The anonymous posts were getting more detailed, more specific, and more dangerous to her reputation. Someone out there knew exactly what had happened during the Sterling divorce, and they were preparing to share that knowledge with the world. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Thompson sat in his modest apartment, staring at his laptop screen. For 2 years, he had been documenting Victoria's manipulations, recording conversations, and collecting evidence of her elaborate scheme to destroy Sarah Mitchell's life. As David's head of security, he had access to information that could expose the truth behind the divorce, the corporate espionage charges, and Victoria's rise to power. The decision to go public hadn't been easy. Marcus respected David, even liked him, but he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman suffer while Victoria built her empire on lies and manipulation. The anonymous posts were just the beginning. Marcus had enough evidence to bring down Victoria's entire operation, but he needed to be strategic about how he released it. He opened a new browser window and began typing his next post. This one would focus on the financial records that showed suspicious payments from Victoria's accounts to key witnesses in the divorce proceedings. By tomorrow, the internet would have a new piece of the puzzle, and Victoria's perfect image would be one step closer to complete destruction. Back in the Bentley, Victoria's phone buzzed with another notification. Her engagement photos, which had been trending just hours before, were now being used in memes mocking her for being a homewrecker and a fraud. The comments section had become a battlefield between her supporters and an army of internet users who had decided she was the villain in this real-life drama. David finally spoke, his voice cutting through her panic like a knife. "We need to talk when we get home. Victoria, about everything." The tone in his voice made Victoria's stomach drop. She had heard that same cold, business-like tone during board meetings when David was about to fire someone. For the first time since she had started her campaign to win him, Victoria realized she might have overplayed her hand. The internet had spoken, and it was demanding the truth, whether she was ready to face the consequences or not. The carefully constructed lies that had built her empire were about to come crashing down around her. The emergency meeting at Victoria's downtown penthouse felt more like a war room than a crisis management session. Rebecca Chen spread documents across the marble dining table while her team of digital specialists worked frantically on their laptops, trying to stem the hemorrhaging of Victoria's online empire. The golden hour lighting that usually made Victoria's apartment perfect for Instagram shoots now seemed harsh and unforgiving. "We're hemorrhaging followers faster than I've ever seen," announced Jake Morrison, Victoria's head of digital strategy. "It's not just people unfollowing, it's active backlash. They're commenting on old posts, calling you out for everything from product placements to sponsored content. The algorithms are starting to suppress your reach." Victoria paced behind them, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors like a countdown timer. She had changed into a soft pink sweater and minimal makeup, crafting an image of vulnerability for the cameras she knew would be waiting outside. But her calculated appearance couldn't hide the panic in her eyes as she watched 2 years of carefully built success crumble in real time. Rebecca looked up from her phone with grim news. TMZ just published a timeline of David's divorce and your relationship. They're asking pointed questions about when you started dating him versus when the corporate espionage allegations surfaced. Someone leaked documents to them. What kind of documents? Victoria demanded, though she already suspected the answer. Financial records showing payments from your personal accounts to employees at Sterling Tech. The same employees who testified against Sarah Mitchell during the divorce proceedings. Rebecca's voice was steady, but her expression was grave. Victoria, if these documents are authentic, they prove you bribed witnesses to lie about Sarah. The room fell silent except for the sound of typing and the distant noise of Chicago traffic 20 floors below. Victoria's team exchanged glances, and she could see the calculation in their eyes. They were already planning their exit strategies, preparing to distance themselves from a client who was becoming radioactive to their own careers. They can't prove anything, Victoria said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Those payments could have been for anything: consulting fees, personal services, gifts to friends. Jake snorted. $5,000 consulting fees to a janitor, Victoria. The internet isn't stupid. They're connecting dots faster than we can create alternative explanations. Victoria's phone buzzed with a call from David. She stared at the screen, knowing that answering would likely mean the end of everything she had worked for, but ignoring him would only make things worse. She swiped to accept the call and put it on speaker. Victoria, we need to talk. Now. David's voice was cold and businesslike, the tone he used when someone was about to be fired. David, darling, I'm in a meeting with my team. Can this wait until later? No, it cannot wait. I've been doing some investigating of my own, and I have questions that need answers. Questions about payments you made during my divorce proceedings. The room seemed to shrink around Victoria as David's words confirmed her worst fears. Somehow, he had gotten access to her financial records, probably through Marcus or his team of corporate investigators. The game was up, but she had to try one last gambit. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, forcing confusion into her voice. What payments? The $5,000 you paid to Kevin Matthews, the janitor who claimed he saw Sarah copying files after hours. The $3,000 you gave to Jennifer Walsh, the secretary who said Sarah asked suspicious questions about client lists. The $10,000 you paid to Thomas Riley, the IT specialist who testified that Sarah had accessed files she wasn't authorized to see. With each name David mentioned, Victoria felt another piece of her carefully constructed world collapse. She had been so careful, using cash transactions and personal meetings to avoid leaving digital trails. But somehow, David had found the connections anyway. Rebecca and her team were already packing their laptops, recognizing a sinking ship when they saw one. Jake paused at the door, looking back at Victoria with something that might have been pity. For what it's worth, it was a brilliant plan. Too bad you underestimated how much people love an underdog story. As her team filed out, Victoria was left alone with David's voice coming through her phone speaker and the weight of her crumbling empire pressing down on her. Outside her floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see news vans gathering in the street below, their satellite dishes aimed at her building like modern-day siege weapons. David, please, you have to understand, she began. But he cut her off. I understand perfectly. You saw an opportunity to destroy my marriage and take my wife's place, and you executed it flawlessly. You turned me against the woman I loved, convinced me she was a traitor, and manipulated me into throwing away the best thing in my life. Victoria's last desperate play came from pure instinct. But David, I did it for us. I saw how unhappy you were with her, how she was holding you back from your true potential. I freed you from a marriage that was already failing. The silence that followed was deafening. When David finally spoke, his voice was quiet but deadly. You didn't free me from anything. Victoria, you destroyed the only real love I've ever known. And now I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are." The call ended, leaving Victoria alone in her penthouse with the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant rumble of the city below. Through her windows, she could see photographers setting up across the street, their long lenses trained on her building. The internet had already convicted her in the court of public opinion, and now the real world was closing in. Her phone buzzed with notifications as the story exploded across every platform. Anonymous sources were confirming David's allegations, sharing more evidence of her manipulation campaign. The hashtag Victoria Kane Exposed was trending alongside pregnant ex-wife collapse, and the comments were brutal in their assessment of her character. For the first time since she had started her campaign to win David Sterling, Victoria Kane realized she had lost everything: her followers, her brand deals, her reputation, and now the man she had sacrificed everything to possess. She had played the game perfectly, but she had forgotten that in the age of social media, the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep you try to bury it. The golden hour light faded from her windows as Victoria sat alone in her designer penthouse, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed life, waiting for the inevitable knock on her door from reporters who would want to hear her side of the story she could no longer deny. Sarah Mitchell woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the hospital bedside table. The notifications had been coming in waves since the story broke, but this was different. As she scrolled through the messages, her eyes widened with disbelief. Screenshots of financial documents, recorded conversations, and testimony from former Sterling Tech employees were spreading across social media like wildfire. Dr. Walsh entered the room carrying Sarah's discharge papers and wearing an expression of cautious optimism. "Well, Miss Mitchell, your blood work has improved significantly. The fluids and rest have done you good. But I want you to promise me you'll take better care of yourself going forward." "I will," Sarah said, though her attention was divided between the doctor and the incredible story unfolding on her phone. Someone was systematically exposing Victoria Kane's entire manipulation campaign, complete with evidence that proved Sarah's innocence in the corporate espionage case. "There's someone here to see you," Dr. Walsh added. "A lawyer named Emma Chen. She says she represents you, though I wasn't aware you had legal representation." Sarah frowned. She hadn't hired a lawyer and certainly couldn't afford one. But before she could voice her confusion, a petite Asian woman in an expensive suit entered the room carrying a briefcase and wearing a determined expression. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Emma Chen from Chen's, Rodriguez and Associates. I specialize in wrongful termination and defamation cases." Emma's handshake was firm, her voice confident. "I believe you've been the victim of an elaborate frame job, and I'd like to help you get justice." "I can't afford a lawyer," Sarah said immediately. "Whatever's happening online doesn't change the fact that I'm barely scraping by." Emma smiled and opened her briefcase, pulling out a tablet loaded with documents. "Actually, Miss Mitchell, I think you're about to be in a very different financial position. The evidence emerging about Victoria Kane's manipulation campaign is ironclad. We're looking at a slam-dunk case for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with your employment." As Emma scrolled through the evidence, Sarah felt a familiar emotion she hadn't experienced in 18 months: hope. The financial records showed clear payments to witnesses who had testified against her. Recorded conversations revealed Victoria coaching them on what to say. Most damning of all were text messages between Victoria and her associates discussing their plan to eliminate the wife obstacle. "Who's releasing all this information?" Sarah asked, still struggling to believe that someone had been documenting Victoria's crimes all along. We're not entirely sure, but the person goes by the handle Justice for Sarah. They've been methodically releasing evidence for the past 6 hours, each post more damaging than the last. It's like they've been planning this reveal for months. Sarah's phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a direct message from the mysterious account, Miss Mitchell, you deserve to know the truth about what was done to you. Check your email for a package that will help your lawyer build an airtight case. It's time for justice. Marcus T. Marcus Thompson, Sarah breathed, recognizing the name of David's head of security. He's been watching this whole time. Emma leaned forward, her eyes bright with the prospect of a case that could make her career. Sarah, with this evidence, we can not only clear your name, but also seek significant damages. We're talking about millions in lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages. Victoria Kane destroyed your reputation and your marriage through deliberate fraud. But Sarah barely heard the talk of money and legal victories. She was thinking about David, wondering if he was seeing the same evidence, if he was finally understanding what had really happened to their marriage. The betrayal hadn't come from her. It had come from the woman now wearing his engagement ring. As if summoned by her thoughts, David appeared in the doorway. He looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance rumpled and exhausted. His eyes met Sarah's across the room, and she saw something she hadn't seen in years: regret, pain, and the dawning realization of what he had lost. Sarah, he started, then stopped, seeming to notice Emma for the first time. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company. David Sterling, Emma said, standing and extending her hand with professional courtesy. I'm Emma Chen, Sarah's attorney. I was just explaining to your ex-wife that she has grounds for a very substantial lawsuit against Victoria Kane. David nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. I've been following the story online. Marcus has been very thorough in his documentation. He paused, struggling with words that seemed too small for the magnitude of his betrayal. Sarah, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you your life back. The question is, Emma interrupted smoothly, what are you prepared to do about it? Your testimony about how Victoria manipulated your perceptions would be invaluable in proving our case. David straightened, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked like the decisive CEO who had built a tech empire from nothing. Whatever you need, I'll testify. I'll provide financial records. I'll make public statements. Victoria Kane destroyed the most important thing in my life, and I intend to make sure she faces consequences for what she's done. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she watched David commit to fighting for her vindication. It was 18 months too late to save their marriage, but it might not be too late to save her future and their child's security. Emma was already pulling out contracts and legal documents, her mind racing with strategies and timelines. We'll need to move fast. Public opinion is on our side right now, but these stories have short lifespans. We file everything this week while the evidence is fresh and the media attention is focused. Outside the hospital room, the world was rapidly reshaping itself around the truth that Marcus Thompson had so carefully documented. Victoria Kane's social media empire was collapsing in real time, her follower count dropping by thousands every hour. Major brands were not just pausing partnerships, but actively distancing themselves from her with public statements expressing their commitment to authentic influencers. But for Sarah, sitting in that hospital room with her unborn child and the man who had unknowingly betrayed her, the most important victory was smaller and more personal. She was no longer alone in her fight for justice. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, The possibility of a future where her child would grow up knowing that sometimes, even when everything seems lost, justice can prevail. The war for Sarah Mitchell's reputation was just beginning, but for the first time in 18 months, she had an army fighting on her side. The Sterling Technology conference room had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom of public opinion. While Emma Chen prepared for the legal battles ahead, David had insisted on making a public statement that would leave no doubt about Victoria's manipulation and Sarah's innocence. Major news networks had been invited, along with carefully selected social media influencers who specialized in exposing corporate fraud and social justice issues. Victoria Kane sat in her penthouse watching the live stream with growing dread. Her remaining team had abandoned her. Her brand partnerships had evaporated overnight, and now she was about to watch the man she had schemed so hard to win destroy her completely on national television. David stood at the head of the conference table, flanked by Marcus Thompson and a team of lawyers. The man who had always been so careful about his public image now looked raw and honest, his usual corporate polish replaced by genuine emotion. 18 months ago, I made the worst mistake of my life, David began, looking directly into the camera. I divorced my wife, Sarah Mitchell, based on evidence that I now know was completely fabricated. I want to tell you exactly how I was manipulated, how an innocent woman was destroyed, and how the truth was hidden from everyone, including me. He clicked a remote, and the wall screen filled with financial records showing Victoria's payments to Sterling Tech employees. Victoria Kane systematically bribed key employees at my company to lie about my wife's conduct. She paid a janitor $5,000 to claim he saw Sarah copying confidential files. She paid a secretary $3,000 to say Sarah asked suspicious questions. She paid an IT specialist $10,000 to testify that Sarah accessed unauthorized systems. The audience of reporters leaned forward as David continued his methodical destruction of Victoria's credibility. Each piece of evidence was more damning than the last, painting a picture of a calculated campaign to destroy a marriage for personal gain. But the financial records are just the beginning, David said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Marcus Thompson, my head of security, recorded conversations that prove Victoria coached these witnesses on exactly what to say. Marcus, would you please share what you documented? Marcus stepped forward, his military bearing giving weight to every word. For 2 years, I watched Victoria Kane manipulate situations and people to frame Sarah Mitchell. I have recordings of her bragging about her plan to other influencers. I have text messages where she discussed timing her accusations to maximize damage to the marriage. I have evidence that she planted files on Sarah's computer and then had them discovered by IT security. The room erupted in murmurs as Marcus played audio clips of Victoria discussing her strategy. Her voice was clear and unmistakable as she described Sarah as an obstacle to be eliminated and boasted about how easy it was to turn David against his own wife. I made the evidence public, Marcus continued, because I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman suffer while her destroyer built an empire on lies. Sarah Mitchell never stole anything, never betrayed anyone, and never deserved what was done to her. David took control again, his expression grim. The divorce settlement I gave Sarah was meant to be a clean break from what I thought was her betrayal. When she needed that money to care for her dying father, I had no idea because I had cut off all communication. When she discovered she was pregnant with my child, she didn't tell me because I had made it clear I wanted nothing to do with her. The revelation about the pregnancy sent another wave of shock through the assembled media. David's voice cracked slightly as he continued. My ex-wife collapsed on the street yesterday because she was working 2 jobs while 7 months pregnant, trying to survive after being professionally destroyed by a fraud. She was alone, struggling, and carrying my child because I was too arrogant and blind to see the truth about what was happening in my own life. Emma Chen stepped forward to address the legal implications. We will be filing lawsuits against Victoria Kane for defamation, fraud, interference with employment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The evidence is overwhelming, and we intend to seek full damages for the destruction of Sarah Mitchell's career and reputation. But David wasn't finished. He turned to face the camera directly, speaking with the authority of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire and was now using that power for justice. Victoria Kane destroyed my marriage through deliberate, calculated fraud. She stole 18 months of my life with my wife and my unborn child. But her actions go beyond personal betrayal. She represents everything wrong with influencer culture, where image matters more than truth and success justifies any level of deception. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. I'm announcing today that Sterling Technology will be establishing a foundation to help victims of workplace fraud and defamation. We will provide legal support, financial assistance, and advocacy for people who have been professionally destroyed by lies and manipulation. The press conference continued for another hour, with reporters asking pointed questions about corporate responsibility, social media culture, and the broader implications of Victoria's fraud. But the damage to Victoria Kane's empire was already complete and irreversible. Across the city, Sarah watched the live stream from her hospital bed, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her vindication playing out in real time. The man who had once believed the worst about her was now using his considerable power and influence to restore her reputation and secure her future. Her phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, friends who had disappeared during the scandal, and even job offers from companies that had seen the press conference. The professional death that Victoria had orchestrated was being rapidly reversed by the power of truth and public accountability. Victoria Kane's phone had stopped buzzing hours ago. Her remaining followers were abandoning her in droves. Her apartment building was surrounded by protesters, and legal notices were already being served by process servers who had pushed through the crowd of reporters. The influencer who had built her empire on the destruction of an innocent woman was about to learn that in the age of social media, the same forces that could elevate someone to fame could destroy them just as quickly when the truth finally emerged. For Sarah Mitchell, justice was no longer a distant hope. It was happening in real time, broadcast to millions of viewers who were witnessing the complete collapse of one of the most calculated frauds in recent memory. The courtroom of public opinion had rendered its verdict, but the legal system was just getting started. Within 48 hours of David's press conference, Victoria Kane found herself facing a cascade of legal challenges that would have impressed even the most seasoned white-collar defense attorneys. Emma Chen had moved with lightning speed, filing a comprehensive lawsuit that sought damages in the tens of millions. Victoria sat in the offices of Hartman, Blake & Associates, one of Chicago's most expensive law firms, watching her lead attorney struggle to find a defense strategy for the overwhelming evidence against her. Gerald Hartman was known for his ability to spin even the most damaging facts, but the recordings, financial records, and witness testimony created a nearly impossible case to defend. The problem is simple, Hartman explained, reviewing the evidence spread across his conference table. They have you dead to rights on multiple counts. The financial records prove you paid bribes. The recordings prove you orchestrated the fraud. The text messages prove intent and planning. There's no ambiguity here. Victoria's hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup. In 72 hours, she had gone from being one of social media's most powerful influencers to a pariah facing potential criminal charges and financial ruin. Her penthouse was under siege by protesters and reporters. Her bank accounts were being frozen pending the civil litigation, and her remaining assets were being evaluated for seizure. "What about a settlement?" she asked desperately. "Maybe we could offer to make restitution, pay Sarah Mitchell a significant sum to make this go away quietly." Hartman shook his head grimly. "Miss Kane, this case is far beyond quiet settlements. David Sterling has made this a personal crusade, and he has unlimited resources to pursue justice. More importantly, Sarah Mitchell isn't just seeking money. She wants complete vindication, and she deserves it." Across town, Sarah sat in Emma Chen's office reviewing job offers that had been pouring in since David's press conference. Companies that had once blacklisted her were now competing to hire her, offering salaries that exceeded what she had made at Sterling Technology. The professional resurrection was happening faster than she had dared to hope. "The settlement offers are already coming in," Emma reported, reviewing messages from Victoria's legal team. "They're desperate to avoid a trial, but I want to talk to you about something more important than money." Sarah looked up from the job offers, curious about what could be more significant than the financial security she desperately needed. "David Sterling wants to have a conversation with you, not about the legal case, not about Victoria Kane, but about your child and your future together as co-parents." The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 18 months, she had prepared herself to raise this child alone, never imagining that David would be part of their lives. The idea of co-parenting with the man who had unknowingly betrayed her was both terrifying and hopeful. "I don't know if I'm ready for that conversation," Sarah admitted. "So much has happened, so much pain and misunderstanding. How do we move past all of that?" Emma leaned forward, her expression gentle but practical. "Sarah, you're about to be a mother. Your child deserves to have both parents in their life, if that's possible. David has made it clear that he wants to be involved, that he wants to make amends for what happened. You don't have to make any decisions today, but you should at least hear what he has to say." Meanwhile, Victoria Kane's world continued its spectacular collapse. Her former business manager had released a tell-all interview describing the toxic culture Victoria had created, where success was measured by the ability to destroy competitors and manipulate public opinion. Former friends and collaborators were sharing their own stories of Victoria's manipulative behavior, creating a pattern of conduct that went far beyond the Sterling divorce. The influencer marketing industry was in crisis mode, with major platforms implementing new verification and ethical standards in response to the Victoria Kane scandal. Her case had become a cautionary tale about the dark side of social media culture, where authenticity could be manufactured and truth could be buried under carefully crafted lies. Dr. Jennifer Walsh checked on Sarah one final time before her discharge, pleased to see the dramatic improvement in her patient's condition. The stress lines around Sarah's eyes had softened, and for the first time since her admission, she looked like a woman who had hope for the future. "Remember what I told you about stress and its impact on pregnancy," Dr. Walsh reminded her. "The good news is that your blood pressure has normalized, and the baby is showing excellent vital signs, but you need to prioritize your health and well-being going forward." Sarah nodded, her hand resting on her belly where their child was growing. "Doctor, I have a question. Is it safe for me to have a conversation with my ex-husband about the baby, about our future? I don't want to do anything that might jeopardize my pregnancy." Dr. Walsh smiled knowingly. "Sarah, one of the best things you can do for your baby is to create a stable, loving environment. If having that conversation might lead to a positive co-parenting relationship, then it's absolutely worth having. Just take things slowly and trust your instincts." As Sarah prepared to leave the hospital and face whatever came next, Victoria Kane sat in her penthouse watching her social media empire burn in real time. Her follower count had dropped to less than 100,000, most of whom seemed to be there purely to witness her downfall. Her brand partnerships had not just ended, but had resulted in lawsuits from companies seeking to recover their investment in her fraudulent image. The woman who had built her life on the destruction of others was learning that karma, while sometimes slow, was absolutely merciless in its pursuit of justice. The truth had emerged. The evidence was overwhelming, and the reckoning she had avoided for 2 years was finally at hand. But for Sarah Mitchell, the collapse of Victoria Kane's empire meant something much more important than revenge. It meant vindication, security for her child, and the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. The hardest conversations were still ahead, but for the first time in 18 months, she faced them with hope instead of fear. The coffee shop on Lincoln Avenue was far from the glamorous venues where David Sterling usually conducted business, but it felt right for the conversation that would reshape both their lives. Sarah arrived first, choosing a quiet corner table where they could talk without being overheard by curious customers who might recognize Chicago's most talked-about couple. David entered looking nervous in a way Sarah had rarely seen during their marriage. The confident billionaire who commanded boardrooms and built empires seemed uncertain as he approached her table, carrying 2 cups of tea, one of them the chamomile blend he remembered she loved during their early days together. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," David said, settling into the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you would want to see me after everything that's happened." Sarah studied his face, noting the lines of exhaustion and genuine remorse that marked his features. "I'm not here for us, David. I'm here for our child. They deserve to have a father who wants to be involved in their life." The directness of her statement seemed to relieve some of David's tension. This wasn't about romantic reconciliation or complex emotional negotiations. It was about 2 adults making decisions in the best interests of their unborn child. "I want to be more than involved," David said quietly. "I want to be a real father, not just a weekend visitor or a check in the mail. I know I have no right to ask for that after what I allowed to happen to you, but I'm hoping we can build something new for our child's sake." Sarah sipped her tea, using the moment to gather her thoughts. The man sitting across from her was both the person who had hurt her most deeply and the father of her child. Learning to separate those 2 realities would be crucial for their future. "David, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was when we were married. The past 18 months have changed me, made me stronger, but also more cautious. I can't go back to being the woman who trusted blindly or put someone else's needs before my own." "I wouldn't want you to," David replied immediately. "The woman sitting across from me right now is incredible. You survived being professionally destroyed, worked 2 jobs while pregnant, and never compromised your integrity, even when it would have been easier to ask for help. Our child is lucky to have you as a mother." The sincerity in his voice caught Sarah off guard. This wasn't the ambitious, distracted man she had divorced. This version of David seemed to have learned something about what truly mattered. "What happened to Victoria?" Sarah asked, partly from curiosity and partly to gauge David's feelings about the woman whose lies had destroyed their marriage. David's expression hardened slightly. "She's facing criminal fraud charges in addition to your civil lawsuit. The FBI is investigating her for wire fraud and conspiracy. Her influencer career is over. Her assets are being seized, and she'll likely spend several years in prison." "Do you feel guilty about that?" Sarah asked, watching his reaction carefully. David considered the question seriously before answering. "I feel guilty about being manipulated so easily. I feel guilty about not trusting my wife enough to investigate her alleged crimes more thoroughly. But I don't feel guilty about Victoria facing consequences for her actions. She destroyed innocent people for personal gain, and she deserves whatever punishment she receives. Sarah nodded, satisfied with his answer. The David she had married would have found a way to rationalize or minimize Victoria's actions to avoid feeling responsible. This version seemed to understand the difference between accountability and enabling. I've been thinking about names, Sarah said, changing the subject to something more hopeful. If it's a girl, I like Elena. If it's a boy, maybe David Jr., if you'd be comfortable with that. The suggestion hit David like an emotional sledgehammer. The idea that Sarah would consider naming their son after him, despite everything that had happened, was almost more than he could process. Sarah, that would be an honor I'm not sure I deserve. You don't have to deserve it, Sarah said gently. You just have to earn it by being the kind of father our child can be proud of. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, custody arrangements, financial support, medical decisions, and the logistics of co-parenting while living separate lives. David offered to buy Sarah a house closer to his own residence, but she declined, preferring to maintain her independence while accepting his financial support for their child. There's something else we need to discuss, David said as their conversation wound down. The media attention isn't going away anytime soon. Our child is going to grow up in the public eye, whether we like it or not. We need to be prepared for that. Sarah had been dreading this conversation. The idea of raising a child under constant media scrutiny was terrifying, but she knew David was right. Their story had captured public imagination, and their child would inevitably be part of that narrative. We protect their privacy as much as possible, Sarah said firmly. No interviews, no photo shoots, no social media posts featuring our child. We give them as normal a childhood as we can manage. David agreed immediately. Whatever it takes to keep them safe and give them a chance at a normal life. As they prepared to leave, David hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more personal, but unsure how to approach it. Sarah, I know we can't go back to what we were, and I'm not asking for that. But I want you to know that losing you was the worst mistake of my life. Not because of what Victoria did, but because I stopped fighting for us long before she came along. I got so caught up in building an empire that I forgot to protect what I already had. Sarah felt tears threaten as she heard the words she had needed to hear 18 months ago. They were too late to save their marriage, but they might be enough to help them build a friendship worthy of their child. Thank you for saying that, she replied softly. I needed to hear it, even now. They parted ways outside the coffee shop, both understanding that they had taken the first step toward building something new from the wreckage of their past. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time since Sarah's collapse on Michigan Avenue, both of them felt hopeful about the future they could create together for their child. The empire David had built would continue to thrive, but it would no longer be the most important thing in his life. That distinction now belonged to the family he was determined to rebuild, one conversation at a time. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the maternity ward of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, holding her newborn son and watching the sunrise paint Chicago's skyline in shades of gold and pink. David Michael Sterling had arrived 3 weeks early, as if he couldn't wait to meet the world that had been so dramatically reshaped by his parents' story. The legal battles were finally over. Victoria Kane had pled guilty to multiple fraud charges and was serving a 4-year federal prison sentence. The civil lawsuit had resulted in a $28 million judgment that would secure David Michaels' future and fund Sarah's new nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of workplace fraud and reputation destruction. Emma Chen knocked softly on the hospital room door before entering with a tablet full of updates. The brilliant attorney had become not just Sarah's legal advocate, but a close friend who had helped navigate the complex intersection of justice, media attention, and personal healing. "The final settlement documents have been signed," Emma announced with satisfaction. "Victoria's remaining assets have been liquidated, and the foundation is fully funded. You're going to be able to help a lot of people who went through what you experienced." Sarah smiled down at her sleeping son, marveling at his perfect features and the peaceful expression that suggested he had no idea he was already one of the most famous babies in America. The media attention had been intense but manageable, thanks to careful boundaries David and Sarah had established to protect their child's privacy. David entered the room, carrying coffee and looking like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. The transformation in him over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The driven, ambitious businessman was still there, but he had learned to balance success with presence, achievement with relationships. "Any word from the prosecutor's office?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Sarah's bed with the comfortable familiarity they had developed during their co-parenting journey. "Victoria's appeals have been exhausted," Emma reported. "She'll serve the full sentence. The judge was particularly harsh because of the premeditated nature of her crimes and the extensive damage she caused to innocent people." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions about Victoria's fate. The desire for justice had been satisfied, but she took no pleasure in anyone's suffering, even someone who had caused her so much pain. The focus now was on healing and building a positive future for her son. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared in the doorway for her final check before Sarah's discharge. The physician who had treated Sarah during her darkest moment had become a friend and supporter throughout her journey back to health and stability. "How are my favorite patients doing, Doctor?" Walsh asked, examining David Michael with the gentle expertise that had reassured Sarah through countless prenatal appointments. "Perfect," Sarah replied, meaning it completely. Despite everything they had endured, despite the pain and betrayal and public scrutiny, she felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. "The press is already gathering downstairs," Dr. Walsh warned. "They're hoping for photos of Chicago's miracle baby and his famous parents." David and Sarah exchanged a look of understanding. They had discussed this moment extensively, knowing that their son's birth would generate enormous public interest, but determined to maintain the boundaries they had established. "We'll use the private exit," David said. "The statement we prepared should satisfy their curiosity without compromising David Michaels' privacy." The statement, crafted carefully with Emma's help, expressed their gratitude for the public support during their legal battle, their commitment to using their experience to help others, and their request for privacy as they focused on raising their son. It struck the right balance between acknowledging public interest and protecting their family. Marcus Thompson knocked and entered, now serving as head of security for both Sarah and David in their co-parenting arrangement. The man whose courage in exposing the truth had made justice possible had become a trusted friend and protector of their small family. "The car is ready when you are," Marcus reported. "I've coordinated with hospital security to ensure a clean exit." As they prepared to leave, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, she had been a woman destroyed by lies, struggling to survive while carrying a child whose father wanted nothing to do with her. Today, she was a vindicated survivor with a thriving career, a healthy son, and a cooperative relationship with David that prioritized their child's well-being above all else. The nonprofit organization she was launching would help other victims of reputation destruction rebuild their lives and seek justice against their persecutors. Her own experience had taught her that the truth could prevail, but only with patience, courage, and the right support system. David carefully helped Sarah into the wheelchair required for discharge, then gently took their son in his arms. The billionaire who had once measured success by stock prices and market dominance now understood that his greatest achievement was the tiny human being sleeping peacefully against his chest. "Ready?" he asked Sarah, and she nodded. They made their way through the hospital corridors that had witnessed so much drama and healing over the past months. The same building where Sarah had collapsed from exhaustion and despair was now the place where she began her new life as a mother, survivor, and advocate for justice. The private exit led to a waiting car that would take them to Sarah's new home, a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood where David Michael could grow up away from the chaos of public attention. David had purchased a smaller residence nearby, close enough to be present for daily parenting, but far enough to give Sarah the independence she needed. As Marcus drove them through the streets of Chicago, Sarah looked out at the city that had witnessed their fall and their redemption, somewhere in a federal prison. Victoria Kane was beginning to understand the consequences of building an empire on lies and manipulation. But Sarah refused to let thoughts of her destroyer define this moment. Instead, she focused on the future she was building with the sleeping baby in her arms and the man beside her who had learned that the most important conquests in life couldn't be achieved through ambition alone, but required the harder work of trust, forgiveness, and love. The story that had begun with a collapsed woman on Michigan Avenue was ending with a family united not by romance, but by something stronger, the shared commitment to protecting and nurturing the innocent life they had created together. In a world where viral fame was fleeting and social media empires could crumble overnight, they had found something that would last, the unbreakable bond between parents who would sacrifice everything for their child's happiness and security. David Michael Sterling slept peacefully as his parents carried him toward a future built on truth, justice, and the kind of love that could survive even the most devastating betrayals. If Sarah's fight for justice inspired you, smash that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear that truth always wins in the end. Drop a comment telling us what would you have done in Sarah's shoes. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that prove ordinary people can overcome extraordinary betrayals. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light.